Hello guys, welcome to the second video. As I mentioned before, we're going to concentrate here on mostly the colonialism, the British colonialism that has to do with North America, okay? What is known as the New World. By the way, we're starting on the slide number 91. As I mentioned in the previous video, the British um, conquer half the world. They were able to have a colony almost in every single continent. At least one colony in every single continent of the world, and well, they expanded somehow in a short span of time. Now, the colonization of North America started more or less in the 1600s, and there is an interesting thing over here, right? As I mentioned before, these settlers, these people who went to North America, they were contemporary to Shakespeare, right? So while the big plays by Shakespeare, such as Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet or Richard III, any of those was being exhibited for the first time and were being played once and again, well, there was a group of people who arrived into the North American territory in order to establish themselves over there. Now, evidently, they were not the first to be there. There were a lot of people before them, some of them French, some of them Spanish, some of them Dutch. Let's say that if at some point you have seen this movie of The Revenant with Leo DiCaprio, the one when he's attacked with a bear, by a bear, sorry. So you will see the plurality of nationalities that was already inhabiting over there in North America. Now, there are different groups of British people who eventually arrived into North America, but we're going to concentrate on one particular one. And those were the Pilgrims, right? So probably you can remember these guys. I don't know if the name sort of rings a bell or not. But maybe the traditional image, these people dressed in black, that normally had this sort of, let's say, dresses or tunics, or somehow their clothes were very reserved, very concealing, right? And as I mentioned, there was usually a combination of black and white, and normally they are somehow alluded in the moment of Thanksgiving. So, well, this amount of people, this sort of people, sorry, or this group of the population, had a very particular religious orientation and had a very particular moral customs and habits that were very reserved, as I mentioned before. Let's remember that back then, the religion that was mostly somehow developed or spread, that mostly was spread in Britain, had to do with some variations of Christianity, some variations of these beliefs related to Protestants and all these different things, right? So there were different combinations of religions over there, but those were the ones that were more somehow extended. Now, in that context, these pilgrim people, these guys, well, didn't fit very well. And you will see that segregation, exclusion for religious reasons have always been a terrible thing, right? Like, depending on your territory, if you belong to a different creed, if you have different beliefs, odds are you're going to suffer a lot. So they were not the exception. They were always segregated, they were always hated, they were not welcome at all. They somehow I mean, it was difficult for them to get a job, to maintain a job, to had some sort of good way of living. So at some point they say, you know what, fuck it, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to stand it. We have listened about this new land, this new territory that apparently is good and it's fertile and it's nice, and it couldn't be worse than here, right? So let's go. And let's say there was a big amount of those population that decided just to make their preparations, take their wives, their children, and travel to a new world. Different from the French and Spanish and Dutch, who sort of wanted just to go and make trade, and maybe just return rich to their homeland. Well, no, it was a one-way trip in this case. Yes, they say there's nothing for us in Britain. We're going to establish ourselves in this new land in North America, but we don't want to return to Britain. We just want to stay there, and that is going to be like our new land. And they were very strict in their tradition. So they were traveling to a different country or to a different territory, but they wanted to preserve their customs, their habits, their religions, and of course they didn't expect anybody like to force them to do otherwise. So they traveled to the United States or to North America with this idea, right? With the idea of being very conservative, of being a very secluded community, and preserve what they couldn't back in Britain. Now, here comes an affirmation that I always do, and that it's in consonance with what I mentioned since the very beginning, that there's no such thing as pure English, original English, or uncontaminated English. Well, and is this statement, guys? Basically, we could say that technically American English is more British than British English, right? We always have this comparison between American accent and the original supposedly British English, but there's no such thing. So take a look at what happened over here, right? Remember that they had this, we're going to call it language, dialect, or type of English that was spoken during the Renaissance or / British colonialism era, and they took that language over there into America. They didn't talk to anybody else than each other. Yes, well, we will see that they had a little contact with Native Americans, but in general, it maintained that way. Yes, they preserved the same pronunciation, accents, the same vocabulary, somehow the same grammar, right? And they took that to America. Now, in Britain, language continued like developing, changing, advancing, being fed by the people who returned from the colonies, from Australia, from India. All these words were nurtured somehow into the British English and continued like evolving, right? Change, if you want, contaminated, right? So this original that was not original in the first place because it was German and Greek and Latin and French will continue advancing, while the language that was spoken in North America stayed like that, froze, fossilized somehow, right? Because they didn't really have a chance after, many years to be in contact with somebody else. So if you take a look at it, you could say that American English is purest or more similar to the original British language or British English that it is right now, let's say the language that is spoken in Britain. So it's one of those curiosities that are interesting in there, right? So curiously, if we are going to compare words such as fall or autumn, yes, that one is supposed to be American and the other British, or trash and rubbish, or hog and pig, or sick or ill, where they actually sort of reversed, right? Like we've always been like told that trash is American and rubbish is British, but I mean, if it was the pilgrims coming from Britain, the ones that introduced that topic, well, it is like reverse. I know it sort of blows our mind a little bit and it's confusing, but hopefully you get the point. Okay, well, eventually, after the settling and after the idea of somehow being completely isolated and everything, unavoidably, some external words were introduced. Some Native American words were introduced into the English language, right? So why do you think that happened? Yeah, because they were so sort of self-sufficient. They were more civilized than the savages, than the Native American people, right? As they were perceived, of course, in that way, savages, soulless, not even human. Well, eventually they are required to use this vocabulary, this native vocabulary or words, for very specific reasons. As I mentioned, they were pretty conservative. They really didn't like to include new words because that was some sort of betrayal to their tradition. But they had to do it sometimes. Yes. So, for example, we have the cases of words such as, and you will see this in the slide number 93, such as raccoon, opossum, or moose, or chipmunk, tomato, hickory, all these different things, right? Why? Why did they adopt this? Well, because they were completely new things. They didn't have that in Britain. Yes, they didn't have this sort of animals. Those animals were endemic species. They were native to the land that they were visiting, or well, in which they settled, because they didn't visit, they stayed there. So there was no way, or no way in which occurred to them to call these new things, plants, animals, vegetables, fruit, because they didn't have an equivalence in there. So just for pure necessity of calling them in a different way, they just adopted the native terminology for that. So that is like one possibility, right? Like one reason. Now, then we have some other things that are tricky. Yes, take a look at the vocabulary that are in the third line over there, such as canoe or moccasin or tomahawk, for example, right? Don't they have that in Britain? Sure, because well, a canoe is essentially a boat, right? A moccasin is a type of shoe, right? And then the tomahawk, I don't know if you're familiarized with the word, but basically that is an axe that you throw away. It's small, so you usually use that for combat or for hunting. Yeah, so it's a throwable projectile axe. Now, they have all that in Britain, didn't they? Not really. Yes, they have similar things. So, they didn't have canoes exactly per se. They have boats, yes. Take into account that the Native American canoe usually was made out of a little bit of wood, just like the one in Britain. But in this case, they usually sew that together with pieces of skin animals. So it was not exactly, I mean, saying the same boat at the time was not exactly the same canoe. Yes, not exactly the same. What about shoe and moccasin, right? So I don't know if you're aware, but a moccasin is a type of shoe that doesn't have laces. Yes, so you cannot just tie it with laces. It is closed completely. So Native American people, what did was, again, out of most of the times animal skins. They sewed together with pieces of leather, and it was a closed type of shoe that didn't have laces, like they didn't have use for that. So again, it is the same thing, or the general same thing, but it's slightly different. What about the tomahawk? Yes, in Britain probably they have the axe, but it was bigger. It has the purpose of cutting wood, maybe trees, maybe for carpenters, for different professions, but not exactly this small axe that was usually decorated with some feathers, and as I mentioned before, had the purpose of mostly hunting or combat. No, that is something that hopefully they didn't need in Britain so constantly. Okay, so this is how somehow the Native American words filter a little bit into the this very conservative and strict and close language that was brought by the Pilgrims. Well, very well. Here we go with a second part that is quite important, that is also very, very fundamental in this Renaissance, British colonialism period. And it's the Afro-American English, the African American, right? So, back then, as I mentioned before, Britain was expanding, was going everywhere around the world, establishing colonies, establishing all these different things that allowed them to have more land, more resources. So they required to have a cheap, let's say, personnel or staff in order to do whatever they required, since harvesting, constructing, mining, well, you name it, right? And what's the best way to do this? Well, African American people. Yes, people, it's not African American, but then it was only African, right? We will go back to that term of African American in a moment. So, they found out that slavery was great business. I mean, it was really good. You only invested a short amount of money relatively short, into getting your boat and the preparation and the crew and capturing these people out of Africa, and then you could bring hundreds of people to work for free. I mean, you didn't have to pay anything to them, and they could sell them, and they would make perfect workers, right? So that was the logic. Yes, that was a commercial logic that instrumentalized people without any sort of consideration. Because then again, they were so different from their own appearance and beliefs and language that they were, one more time, not considered human. Yes, they were considered soulless, savages. They were merely like talking tools, right? Not much. I mean, there was not really a big difference between a shuttle and an African person. They went into Africa, these big expeditions, and this was big business. I mean, slavery became such a profitable business for different countries that it is actually amazing that until very recently, slavery, officially speaking, slavery still existed, right? It was only by the end of 19th century and beginning of the 20th that, for example, Portugal and Brazil still had legal slavery, right? That is pretty recent, guys. It's just, a couple of years ago, not many years ago. I mean, 20th century, 19th century, it's really, really close. Even if it's 100 years ago, it's still really close, but it's less than that in some cases. So many of these economies were able to be maintained because of this. Now think about this, guys. Why do you think that slavery was permitted by the tribes of African people? Yes, you know that all these tribes usually have had big warriors. You also know the genotype of the African person, that is normally really strong, really capacitated, and if we sort of compare anthropologically in some cases, for combat or for some physical features because of the conditions that they have to sustain and endure in the African continent. Sometimes they are even more qualified for survival and for somehow some activities than the traditionally conceived white man, right? So why didn't they rebel? Why didn't they resist? Yes, because probably the first time it was a surprise, but then when all these boats started arriving to the coast and kidnapping people and doing that, why do you think it was that? Well, it says that there's a different reasons, right? First one is, as I mentioned, the surprise. Second, weaponry. Weaponry was, of course, more advanced in some cases. But I would say that the most definitive reason for this was the fact that they were devilishly clever, the kidnappers or the slavers. Normally what they did was arrive into a particular town, a village I mean, usually on the coast. They usually killed the warriors of the tribe or the people who were in charge of defense, or the people who were stronger, that could eventually be problematic. And they took kids or teens, women, right? And then they went all along the coast doing the same process, but every time they would take just a few. When I say a few, I don't know, 10 or 20, it really depends on the number, a few of the same tribe. And then they repeated the same process in the next village that was far away all along the coast. Yeah, and they traveled the whole way. In the end, they had 200, 300 people that had all different dialects, that spoke all a different language. So you could imagine that organizing for rebellion was really, really difficult back then. Yes, between a group of 200 scared children and teen and women that couldn't even spoke to each other. That was, let's say, a terribly clever way to minimize conflict. Plus that, in many cases, the slavers made sure that the captured slaves were from rival tribes. Yes, so tribes that hated each other, so they would never going to collaborate in escape plans or something like that. This was horrible, really intelligently horrible strategy that somehow produced these results. Well, these people were taken to different places. Right now, we're going to concentrate on North America. So they were taken over there. At the beginning, they were basically exhausted to death. Yes, like they just were taken over there, and they were made to work with minimum food and water until they just got tired and died, and then they were replaced. But eventually, they found cheaper ways to do that, and it was reproduction. Yes, so they were able to, let's say, raise slaves as cattle. Just allow them the reproduction, and then some African people started being born among the slaves and among the new territory, and now we can say that they were called African American. This has had some different impacts in language, and we will see that very briefly in the next video. So for now, let's finish with that, with these slaves arriving into America after this very traumatic process of slavery, after many of them died during the trip, but well, eventually they arrived into North America. So guys, see you in the next video. I think that with that we will finish British colonialism. Thanks.